Chapter 18. Mike. Mike sprinted along the sidewalk, followed by the other 7 in his team. Once he reached his intended ambush spot, he only slowed long enough to grab a man by the collar and point him to a spot on the side of a house or behind a stone planter box. When the last of the police officers were in place, Mike raced further up the street before crossing over and ushering the brothers into position. The positioning wasn't optimal, but the terrain didn't really lend itself to allowing a true L-shaped ambush formation. His plan was to initiate the ambush once the North Koreans were well past his location. This would trigger the cops on the other side of the street. Mike and the brothers just had to be disciplined in how far to their right they swept their rounds. Too far to the right, and they'd walk their fire right into Alex and the other cops. As he lay on the ground hugging a brick planter, he wondered how many people were looking through their windows at him and his team. How many people were trying to figure out just what in the hell was going on. He hoped no one came out to investigate. This would blow their cover, but it was too late to worry about such matters. He caught sight of the first soldier as he bounded around a vehicle, scanned the road ahead, then waved his team forward. Mike pressed his face into the soft soil, willing himself into invisibility as he breathed in the earthy scent of the dirt. The men drew closer, and finally came abreast his position. He could hear a few terse words between 2 of the men as they proceeded past, but wouldn't have been able to make out the words, whether in English or Korean. Their cadence was definitely not English. When the last man was directly to his front, Mike's finger slid off the side of his magazine well, dropping onto and around the trigger of his rifle. His thumb simultaneously rotated the shot selector from safe to fire. He waited until the man glanced back and then faced forward again before applying pressure to the trigger. The EOTech HWS EXPS-3 holographic 4-dot sight rested on the retreating man's back. Mike felt the sear break, followed by the high-pitched snap of the supersonic rounds leaping across a short distance, breaking through the sound barrier with sharp cracks as they tore through their target. As the North Korean sagged and then dropped to the ground, an odd, almost eerie silence hung in the air. Mike wondered briefly if asking the cops to kill in cold blood had been too large a departure from what they'd been conditioned to do in their profession. The eruption of gunfire from the opposite side of the street answered that question as the cops engaged the North Korean soldiers. As the front yards to his left literally exploded with gunfire, G watched the 2 men in front of him pivot to the right, toward the deafening cacophony. In his periphery, he saw his lead man drop to the ground. He pushed that from his mind as he registered the muzzle flash signature of a weapon beside a house ahead to his right. War doctrines differed from country to country based on a myriad of cultural differences or other influences. One doctrine that generally remained intact across the board was how a unit reacted when ambushed. Run and you die. Fight and you have a chance. So G pushed forward, leveled his rifle at the spot he'd seen the muzzle flash, and pumped his trigger like a man possessed. His mind grasped the gravity of his situation when the gunfire from the soldier to his left went quiet. At least 2 of his men were down. They were likely dead or dying, while he began to charge a fortified position manned by an unknown number of fighters with unknown levels of training or skill. A sickening thud to his front indicated he'd hit pay dirt. G shifted his weapon's sights to the right and picked up another muzzle signature and pounded at it mercilessly with the remaining ammunition in his rifle. G was close enough to see the man who lay in a prone position, firing in his general direction. A slight adjustment on his part, and the man would be dead. Before he could fire again, something blasted him in the back, knocking him face down. He'd been shot. The breath was gone from his lungs, but he was still thinking, scheming, and trying to regain his feet. He rolled to his side and found himself in the front yard of a small, white house with blue trim around the windows. He kicked out, pushing himself closer to the house while searching for targets out towards the street. All 5 of his men lay on the asphalt in various contorted poses, as if frozen in time during some demented yoga class. Although they were clearly down and out of the fight, the shots didn't subside. The bodies of his men continued to receive incoming rounds. That told G he was not dealing with professionals, and that gave him a paltry amount of solace. Scrambling to his feet, he made a run for the back of the little blue-trimmed home. The siding disintegrated as his ambushers directed their fire at their last remaining target. Rounding the side of the house, he felt a tug at his right shoulder. Not a blow, just a burning, tearing tug. The tug announced he'd been shot for the second time in less than 10 seconds. He pinned his rifle to his chest with his left arm and drew his right elbow in close to his side, trying his best to protect it against any further damage his desperate escape might cause. G was no longer fighting. He was running for his life after seeing his entire team decimated before his very eyes. He was no coward, but every warrior adhered to the live to fight another day mindset when faced with an impossible situation. In the backyard, he hurled himself over a 5-foot wooden fence, fell to the ground on the other side with a guttural grunt, clambered to his feet, and kept running. His mind was already processing tasks in the order they needed to happen. He needed desperately to get off the X, and he was doing his best to complete that first order of business. That was the first item on his list of shit to get done today in order not to die. As soon as he could pause for 30 seconds, he'd assess his wounds and contact the rest of his team to order them away from the storage facility to an alternate rally point. Unfortunately, his team medic lay dead in the street behind him, so even when he linked up with the rest of his team, his injuries would only receive rudimentary attention. With his short-term future objectives cataloged, G assessed his overall condition. The steady flow of blood that ran off his hand caused fear to grip him. His chest tightened as he encountered stabbing chest pains every few minutes. Other than the pain and the blood loss, he was in control. Moving, assessing, planning, that was the important thing. As long as he continued to put distance between himself and the threat, he wouldn't die immediately. His arm screamed in agony as he hauled himself over another fence, dropping hard to the ground in another backyard. His rifle stock bashed his chin as he landed. He didn't bother checking for blood as he staggered to his feet, not with the obscene amount of glistening red fluid that drenched his right arm. Faces lined the back windows of the house whose yard he was in. The residents stared wide-eyed at him as he stumbled toward the side of the house, making for the front yard. Panic threatened to overtake him as more people peered out windows at the bloody Asian man in the strange uniform crashing through their neighborhood, especially after they've just heard what must have sounded like World War III. He pushed harder, though not necessarily faster. His arm pained him greatly, and he had to abandon his rifle to use his left arm to climb, crawl, and balance himself. The rifle hung in its sling, banging against the front of his body as he fled through the American neighborhood. Never in his life would he have placed himself there, not even in his most drunken, wild, narcissistic fantasy of conquering America while draped in the North Korean flag had he imagined himself in a predicament such as he found himself now. He shook the non-productive thoughts from his mind and forced himself on, lost and wishing at least one of his men had survived the ambush. Without slowing, he pulled his map from his pants pocket and held it out with his left hand. There were more dense neighborhoods if he continued to the east. Map in hand, he made a right turn and began working his way to the south, looking for a park, golf course, or the edge of the city. He needed something that would provide him with some concealment, a place he could stop and address the painful wound in his now uncooperative right arm. Walking slower on unsteady legs, Geese pressed his mic and spoke. "Team ambushed! Get to Rally Point Red Tiger! I will rendezvous there!" The response was immediate, the voice excited. "Copy! Team ambushed! Moving to alternate Rally Point Red Tiger!" "Negative! Team is dead! I am moving to Rally Point! Alone! Also, Need medical attention, G gasped as he dragged himself up another street, continuing south. The KPA man on the other end of the radio confirmed he understood, and the two men ended their short conversation. Having just lost close to half of his men in a single, violent event, G knew his mission was blown. He was angry, scared, and wounded. Not a great combination of mental and physical conditions to be experiencing at the same time. Part of him wanted to gather his remaining forces and return to the city building, find Roberta, and shoot her on the spot, but that would do nothing for his mission. It would only satisfy his urge for revenge, and not even on the responsible party. Or had Roberta Maddox set him up to be ambushed? Had she lured him in with feigned cooperation, all the while arranging for a team of men to strike G and his men down? He'd been at this game long enough to know anything was possible on the battlefield. He wouldn't lie to himself or his men once they were reunited. They were in real trouble if a city official had been part of the ambush. If that were true, it meant he'd lost their cooperation, and from that point on, he and his men would be hunted. For whoever orchestrated the ambush, there would be no going back. Whoever they were, they'd be committed to ridding their land of the North Koreans' presence. That was how revolutions were born. Men and women taking their first shots and cutting their teeth on the death of their enemy. After that, there was never any turning back. Not knowing which scenario he faced troubled G. If he proceeded as if Roberta remained an ally and in truth she was not, it could cost the lives of his entire team. If Roberta was, in fact, working against the interests of North Korea, he needed to identify that sooner than later. G would then need to communicate it up through the chain of command so the supply line mission could be altered. He winced at the thought of altering the original plan, knowing his team would either be replaced or augmented, neither of which sat well with him. 12 men seducing the locals into standing down while his people set up the supply line had been the best plan. In the event it failed, brute force in the way of pre-planned aerial strikes along the green zone was part of the backup plan. The issue of the bombing was twofold. The Chinese did not yet fully own the skies above America. This shortcoming meant flying bombers into California was not an option they could accomplish without loss of air assets. American planes would certainly claim many kills during the time needed to level the green zone along Highway 101. Once that happened, the population would turn viciously against the North Koreans on the ground. When that happened, G knew his cover story about offering humanitarian aid would hold about as much water as a moth-eaten pillowcase. The briefings he had attended prior to being inserted into California covered a myriad of details about the terrain, climate, and people. One detail that stuck with every man going into America was the number of gun owners across the country. The briefing indicated that more than 40% of all households in the U.S. had at least one firearm in the home, and that more than 30% of the country's citizens were gun owners, putting the total people in America who owned a gun at somewhere around 80 million people. If those gun owners could be brought to heel, believing they were helping a humanitarian effort, those weapons might be turned on their own government. Conversely, if things slid in the opposite direction, G knew North Korea and China were in for a slugfest. He shook his head, trying to replace all the what-if thoughts with positive and constructive plans. That was a tough task, considering many dear friends lay dead on a street to his rear while he ran for his life. The roads he traveled continued to gain elevation, slowing his progress. He was fine with that, knowing that once he reached a spot where he could see the bay, he'd be able to pinpoint his exact location and move to the rally point. As the road wound its way up into the hills, homes no longer bordered both sides of the street. A sidewalk ran along one side of the brush-bordered road, while a single row of homes sat across from the walkway. G was thankful because fewer homes meant fewer people. Fewer people meant less possibility he'd be approached, shot, or otherwise molested before he was able to reconnect with his surviving teammates. A sign for the Petaluma golf course told him he was about to leave the homes behind. The road narrowed and the landscape opened to sprawling fairways and vividly colored flags flying over the cups atop not so well manicured greens. The absence of maintenance workers showed in the form of the debris-strewn greens and overgrown fairways. G immediately dropped off the road, sliding down into a gully deep enough to hide him from any prying eyes. At the bottom of the gully, he worked to pull his equipment off. Once his gear lay next to him, he pulled his top off, grimacing as the interior of the sleeve stuck to his bloodied arm. Agonizing pain racked his battered body as he peeled his uniform away from his flesh. The arm wasn't broken, and there were no major arteries leaking, or he wouldn't have made it this far. He uncapped his canteen and poured some of the water across his wounded arm. He couldn't tell how bad the gunshot was with the gelatinous mess of half-coagulated blood plastered to and hanging from his bicep. The water helped marginally, dissolving some of the gore to reveal a nasty, jagged tear in the front of his bicep. G knew there would be a second, much smaller hole in the back of his tricep, but he couldn't see it without a mirror, so he felt around with his fingers. Slick with blood, his fingers easily found the small, painful hole, and he gasped, frozen for a few seconds while he desperately tried to draw breath. With his good hand, G poured more water down his shoulder. Once the water ran across his wound, he rubbed the entry hole with his hand. Between pants of anguish, moments of wheezing agony, and just plain old warrior willpower, he cleaned and dressed his wound to the best of his abilities. Although he felt a sense of accomplishment after dressing his own gunshot wound, he was exhausted. The thought of getting his clothes and combat equipment back on his battered body came in a distant second place behind his desire to lay back in the gully and sleep. G knew all too well laying down wasn't an option. A great tour de force lay ahead of him. He was behind enemy lines, beaten, injured, and outnumbered. Even though fear was telling him to lay low, call for help, and abandon his mission, he had to forge on. He drew a long breath in through his nostrils, reminding himself that fear was the father of all liars, its soothing voice working tirelessly on all those weak enough to listen.